Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult, video number 305, The Truth of the Root Race. Because what's happened is that I've read enough literature now, I'm getting the feeling that what I believe truth is that there was a primordial group of humans that basically developed civilization. It was pointed out in a work that I edited not long ago. It is easier for a culture to borrow something from another culture than it is for them to develop it themselves. That is, typically things are developed once. Typically, if there's a diaspora of an idea or something, it's transmitted one group to the other. It wasn't simultaneously thought up by different groups. Yet supposedly, we're supposed to believe that things like horticulture, plant breeding, animal husbandry, and a million other things were developed separately from one another, as opposed to having been developed initially, and then there was a diaspora of humankind, which partially through oral tradition, and then of course, going into different areas, languages diverged. The people that went north had a word for snow, the people in the desert probably didn't. They would say cold rain, or rock rain. It's a very interesting compound. And that there was divergence, and that these groups sort of forgot their initial connection to that original race, that original group of humans. Now, if you read most literature on the subject, a lot of it's early 20th century, late 19th. I believe in the basic premise. The problem is that it seems like every individual group tries to claim that that root race was something in common to them. It's their lineage. Other groups are divergent, whereas what I would say is more likely is that all groups are divergent. So this group would not have been, for instance, as the Nazis attempted to prove and failed, that it was Nordic. Certainly it didn't come out of northern Sweden or something like that. We're talking about in the Caucasus region generally. So we're talking about parts of southern Russia and the Chechen region, through Armenia and Georgia, etc., into parts of Turkey, down into Iraq, over possibly as far as the Indus Valley, actually, parts of North Africa. In this general region of the world, civilization develops, and the diaspora is taking aspects of it. And each different divergent group, and you would have had a lot of divergence anyway, because these groups couldn't have high population density. What's entirely possible is that that initial group, because it was developing proto-civilization, did well enough, and by the way was, humping the Neanderthals at the time, adding more genetics. Some of these groups entered Europe, especially southern Europe. Some were in North Africa. Some diverged. They went east, including across the Bering. And that this primordial group is where civilization began, tens of thousands of years before the oldest remains that we have. It would have taken that long for them to populate enough in order to have done that. Because different families would have stuck together when they became sort of offshoot diaspora, you would have also had genetic divergence. Possibly you would have had some linguistic divergence. This led to the creation of what we would conceive of as modern human phenotypical groups. You can call that a race, or whatever you want to. No individual group is less divergent than any other, or more divergent than any other from that initial group if it was part of that diaspora. Now, this would explain certain genetic abnormalities or deviances, you could say, statistically speaking, in certain remote groups of the world. For instance, the tribes of parts of Central Africa that don't have that same diaspora, it's because that initial group of people had already wandered north out of Africa, probably modern-day East Africa, according to some counts. Could have been Chad. There are remains there. Certainly there are remains in South Africa, there are remains in Tanzania, etc. It's not entirely clear where that origin happens. Groups that stayed there were not part of that latter-day divergence that essentially was sparked by culture. It was sparked by the development of technology and ideas beyond simple genetic divergence. Other groups didn't have that advantage, if you can call it that, because it wasn't part of that same group. After it had left Africa, certainly it was geographically more separate from those that were south of the Sahara Desert. And this is what would be termed root race, although that term is no longer in particular modern parlance. This particular group is the dawning of the diaspora that became the various civilizations of Eurasia, spawns later on, of course, across the Bering and possibly across the ice shelf through the Solutrean hypothesis, which is not widely accepted, but it remains, there's some plausibility there. The various native groups. Native, again, a very loose term in North America and in South America. It appears that there was another diaspora from the Pacific Islands into Peru, actually, at the same time or somewhat before. That's actually funny. People island hopped across the entire Pacific, ended up in Peru, and created a unique genetic lineage. When we realized that people who were using dugouts were capable of doing that, the idea of a Solutrean hypothesis begins to become a little bit more credible. And the idea of people with similar technology tens of thousands of years prior being able to create an entire Eurasian diaspora makes more sense. This, for a while, was hotly debated. The origins of mankind are still not entirely fully fleshed out. What I would say is the occult part of this is that it shows the egotism of man, really, centrally, including among scientists. Of course, they had their own bias, usually, ethnically based. You have all of these different people talking about the same fundamental principle. Atlantis and Lemuria and so forth are also dragged into this basic premise by the Theosophists and by even mainline archaeologists in latter days, like the Bimini Wall and stuff like that, which is interesting subject, Edgar Casey. But all of these people are trying to claim that origin for themselves. It's sort of like when Jesus is depicted now, isn't it? When Jesus is depicted in a black church, Jesus is black. In an Irish church, Jesus has red hair and freckles. In a standard English church, he's got like light brown hair and he's quite pale. In a Norwegian church, he's even paler. In a Middle Eastern church, like in Turkey or something, he's got darker skin. He's got, he's got swarthy features. He's got darker hair and stuff and looks, like me without my glasses on, I guess. Although I think I look a little bit more like Judas. Just saying. That's a joke. I always have to say that now. Some people get really sensitive about religious issues. It's like, oh, okay, whatever. But the fact is that it wouldn't have approximated any of these groups. The best guess climactically, if you look at the people populating the area now, would be basically people from the Levant. So they would have had lighter-ish skin, looked kind of like Syrians or Iranians or something like that. But we're not sure, because there's no photographs. There's no remains of artwork that would necessarily properly depict skin color. Of course, typically it was done with ochre or ash anyway. You don't have any of these things. So we're not sure. They could have been quite a bit darker. After all, they had been in at least North Africa by that time for some time, and this, again, diaspora kept going. They could have, in theory, originated with a group that had gone further and come back into that region. It could have been a group of people who had been for thousands of years mainly in Greece. Or Italy, even. Or they could have been further east in the Indus Valley, wandered back with their new technology. Maybe that's where the diaspora began. That's not the best guess scenario, but we're not exactly sure what specific group. Certainly any language that they had, if they had a written language at all, would be very much in doubt. If they had anything beyond pointing and grunting, we're not sure what accent they used when they were grunting. So we're not sure about these things. It shows the limits of human cognition that everyone in the late 18th and late 19th and early 20th centuries primarily got bogged down in trying to claim that this group came from either a possession of their empire. It came from our island. Yeah, this is where humanity began. From that, or that it was their same race. That's basically what they got bogged down into, and so they tried to go forth. Famously, the Nazis did this, although other groups were doing it decades before. Don't let the British fool you. They were, I think, number one in that aspect. Every group wanted to claim the root race as their own. Everyone was hoping that the first civilized humans looked basically like them. Just like they're hoping the same about their savior when they hit those pearly gates. That's about all. Peace out.